Craig Roberts basically posted. But here's his headline for it. Israel has so much power over the U.S. government and the U.S. military that Israel can attack a U.S. Navy ship and kill and injure most of the crew, and then enlist the President of the United States in a cover-up so complete that survivors and the U.S. media are puzzled. Well, what am I talking about? I'm talking about what happened with the USS Cole. And, and we're going to cover that in just this first second. I mean, we really got to cover this because every once in a while, we got to talk about stuff like this that the media has completely buried, that nobody wants to talk about. Remember, I mean, it wasn't the Cole, it was the Liberty. This is the Liberty. This is an article from America Pravda, and it's posted on the UNS Review. And basically, here's what it says. Concealing the deliberate Israeli attack. Now, first of all, let me stop here for a second with the Liberty. This was a spy ship. It was operating off the coast of Israel. That's a fact. And some people say, and I can't vet this, that they had intercepted some messages from a massive, basically, how should you say, attack on Palestinians, the extermination of a whole bunch of, basically, Palestinians. And they were witness to it and had it on videotape and audio tape or whatever they were doing. I don't know. I can't vet that. And that's one of the reasons the ship came under attack. Now, let me preface what I'm going to say by saying that. But the reality is I can't vet that because I wasn't there and I'm not privy to all of this stuff. And then it goes on, the story goes on. I'm not exactly sure when I first heard of the Liberty incident of 1967. The story was certainly a dramatic one, the attack upon an almost defenseless American intelligence ship flying the American flag by Israeli air and naval forces late in the Six-Day War fought against several Arab states. That's why I think it was because of what they had done to some of these people in the Six-Day War. Over 200 American servicemen were killed or wounded by Israeli machine guns, rockets, napalm, and torpedoes, representing the greatest naval loss of life since World War II. Only tremendous luck and the heroic actions of the sailors prevented the Liberty from being completely sunk with all hands lost, which was the intent of the Israeli military. The Israeli government quickly claimed that the attack had been accidental, flying American colors, a consequence of mistaken identification in the fog of war lie, but none of the survivors ever believed the story true, nor did any of the America's top political or military leaders, notably Secretary of State Dean Rusk, CIA Director Richard Helms, and numerous top officers, including the later chairman of this Joint Chiefs of Staff. They did not believe anything Israel said. Although a brief investigation ordered by President Johnson quickly endorsed the Israeli account, over the next half a century, the Liberty survivors regularly condemned the official verdicts as a cover-up and a whitewash. Their deep outrage was only slightly assuaged by the flood of medals they have received from our guilt-ridden government, once established the Liberty as perhaps the most highly decorated ship in American naval history, at least in regard to a single engagement. The real-life events of that day almost seemed like a script out of Hollywood. The first wave of unmarked attacking jets had targeted and destroyed all of Liberty's regular transmission antennas to prevent them from calling for help, while also trying to jam all standard American broadcast frequencies to prevent any calls for help. A flotilla of torpedo boats later machine gunned the life rafts to ensure there would be no survivors. They sunk the life rafts. These relentless attacks lasted for more than an hour and completely perforated the vessel, with the sides and the decks being pitted by more than 800 holes larger than a man's fist, including 100 rocket hits were 6 to 8 inches wide, and a 40-foot hole below the waterline produced by a torpedo strike. Yeah, that's how much they shot. They wanted to sink this boat. Only a miracle kept the ship afloat. But the desperate sailors braved constant enemy fire to jury-rig a single transmission antenna, allowing them to send out an urgent plea for help. Their SOS was finally received by our nearby 6th Fleet, whose commanders immediately dispatched 2 waves of jet fighters to rescue the Liberty and drive off the attackers, only to have both flights recalled, listen to this, by order of America's highest political leadership, which chose to abandon the Liberty and its cruiser's fate to allow it to be sunk. At the end, 2 large helicopters filled with Israeli commandos, dressed in full battle gear and armed with assault weapons, were preparing to board the Liberty to make sure they had killed everybody on board, to sweep its decks and clear any resistance and then sink it. But at that moment, their headquarters apparently discovered the ship had managed to report its plight to other American military forces, so the enemy, which was Israel, broke off the attack and retreated. The first American assistance finally arrived 17 hours after the first shots had been fired, as 2 destroyers reached the stricken vessel, which was still desperately trying to stay afloat. How many of you heard this story as far as in detail like this? I mean, this is incredible when you really realize what these guys did, what Israel did to cover up their atrocities, the Six-Day War. It's unbelievable. Liberty, America's most advanced electronic surveillance ship, the Liberty, had one of the most unique profiles in the Navy, with the topside covered by an enormous array of different communications antennas, even including a 32-foot satellite dish, which was immediately broken to pieces to bounce signals off the moon. By contrast, the Egyptian vessel they say they thought it was a decrepit old horse transport, just a fraction of the size, which had been rusting away in the port of Alexandria. By nearly all accounts, the air and naval forces deployed against the Liberty were completely unmarked. The Israelis were disguising their origins. None of the calls for help sent out mentioned the identity of the attackers, which the victims only discovered near the very end of the sustained engagement. If the Israeli forces had merely been striking against an assumed Egyptian military vessel, why would they have bothered to conceal their nationality? Despite repeated Israeli claims to the contrary, the Liberty had a very large and very visible American flag flying at all times. And when the first one was shot down by the Israelis and destroyed in the earlier attack, an even larger Star of Stripes was quickly hoisted to prove it was an American flag. Israeli surveillance planes had repeatedly flown over the Liberty all morning, sometimes so low that faces of the pilots could be seen. From the moment the attack began, Israeli electronic jamming had been employed. The Israelis claimed that they initially assumed the Liberty was a warship because it was traveling at a high speed of nearly 30 knots, but the ship's speed during the entire period had been 5 knots. The attack on the Liberty was a massive and coordinated action lasting 1 to 2 hours and involved waves of jet fighters, 3 torpedo boats, a couple of large helicopters loaded with commandos. The initial strike destroyed all of the communications. After the attack had ended, the Israelis said it was an error that they had done. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. This really happened in international waters. And again, Israel had such power over the United States, such power over our administration, according to Paul Craig Roberts, that the government and U.S. military said that Israel can attack a U.S. Navy ship and kill and injure most of the crew, and then unless Lyndon B. Johnson, the President of the United States, in a cover-up so complete that survivors and the U.S. media are muzzled. Think about that for a second, guys. Who controls both houses of Congress? This was 60 years ago, and it was already that complete. That complete. So we got to think through this. Was it all because they're trying to produce and allow Israel to become the world leader in everything? That we're going to have the world ruled from Tel Aviv, from the Israeli Supreme Court through Noahide laws? That's what a lot of people think. That's where it seems to be going. But I want to bring this to you in detail as a memorial and as out of respect to those Liberty survivors who took that hour to 2 hour attack. Just unbelievable that ship stayed afloat, and these guys were so amazing, and they were so decorated after that. Guys, think about who runs the planet. The Jewish mafia, the Italian mafia, the American mafia, organized crime, the Chinese mafia. This list goes on and on for mafioso groups that run drugs out of Southeast Asia, that run drugs out of Afghanistan, that produce huge amounts of fentanyl, allowing them now to shut down a lot of their poppy fields in Afghanistan, because organized crime, working with the central banks, working with the Rothschild banking cartel, answering to their god, their snake god, Isop, and their sacrifices to Moloch, according to this priest from the Catholic Church, by the sacrifice of all these victims under these coronavirus vaccines and these abortions. They're the ones who run the planet, and they have been working with and being controlled by these ancient Canaanite gods of Baal and Moloch and Asherah for the last thousands of years, and they continue to do so. They want their old world order back, and they're doing everything they possibly can to bring that into fruition.